I'm Donna Davis. I'm a visual artist who works across a variety of media, sculpture, installation and digital media. What I was really wanting to do here at the Archives is look at the stories of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area from a floristic perspective. And it was embedded within the Tropical Mountain Flora project. So I wanted to create works that explore climate change and conservation in the wet tropics using the archives as a mechanism to consider a historical narrative coupled with current data that chronicles ecological loss and restoration. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about what is the Tropical Mountain Flora project. So I'm just going to read a little quote from Professor Darren Crane, who's the director up at the Australian Tropical Herbarium. So many species of plants of Australia's tropical mountaintops are found nowhere else on Earth and are threatened by climate change. Urgent precautionary conservation action is required. Conservation in their natural habitat, in situ, is untenable for these species as climate change is rapidly eliminating this habitat. Therefore, the primary aim of this project is to build a viable, secure, ex situ conservation reserve in well-managed botanic garden collections. And you can see here two of the botanists and ecologists up in, on one of the sites. Look at this great big long tool they're using just to take some canopy samples. That tool looks really easy with well-trained people using it. It's very, very tricky to actually get the specimen that they're aiming to get with those tools. So here's me in all my kit up there. Taking photos. So I was really lucky to be invited to be the artist in residence on this project and go up on some of the field trips with the botanists and ecologists on their collection missions, but also visit some of the nurseries that are propagating some of these species. So the Mountain Flora project is currently working to safeguard 20 of some threatened mountaintop flora species. And what we're doing is basically going up to these areas. I think there's about 8 mountaintops. They're all above 1,000 metres up in the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area. And we're collecting plant material and seed material. The plant material is then being propagated in 3 nurseries across the country. And there's also some seed research being done. So for any of those among you that sort of have a bit of an understanding about plants and seed saving, some of the tropical species of plants, their seeds aren't so easy to save because they do have a high moisture content. So there's also some research happening around that as well. Here is Professor Crane, the director of the herbarium, working hard as they all do. There's a lot of work to do when we go out on those field trips. So here we see Dr. Crane just about to press one of the specimens. So when we see a lot of these lovely views of these field trips, I should mention that we're up super early. We're up at about 6 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes we're not getting to bed till 11 or 12 o'clock at night by the time we collect all that material and then get back to our campsites and then have to process all of that material. So they're big days. So they have these great setups in the back of their utes to do everything that they need to do. Here's an example for anyone who hasn't seen a pressed specimen before. That plant that Professor Crane was just about to press was a species called Litsea granitica, and here's the Litsea granitica pressed in one of the herbarium, and that is actually from the April field trip. They're stored in collections. I love working with collections, that's why I love working here at the Archives. So here is the compactus up at the Australian Tropical Herbarium. You can see the little folders in the herbarium cabinets there, and they've got heaps and heaps of specimens. And specimens are collected across all date ranges. So just because you might have one pressed specimen that was collected in April this year, doesn't mean there may not be, a number of specimens collected from many years earlier, and that allows the researchers to have a lot of information to aid in their further research and also DNA perhaps. I also got to visit the Australian National Botanic Gardens down in Canberra, one of the nurseries that is doing some of the propagation trials. So here we see some lovely, healthy little propagated specimens. They're all doing really well, which is really exciting. Up here, up in the inset, you'll see the Litsea granitica again. He's going to be my common law theme that I'm going to tie through this talk. He's also doing really well down there. Here's some other close-up images of some of the species. Some of the species are beautiful and very, very tiny. As you walked through the exhibition, you may have seen some images that may look familiar. And that's because as an artist, I'll take lots of images when I go out on these field trips, and those images will get incorporated into artworks in many different ways. I also just want to draw your attention to the interactive table. As you walked in, you would have seen a big interactive table. This was a collaboration between myself, the Archives and the Australian Tropical Herbarium. It gives some really great background to the Mountain Flora project, so I really encourage you to have a bit of a play with that one. It takes you on a bit of a historical journey. It takes you on journeys from past explorers right up to our current explorers, of our botanists and ecologists exploring those areas and researching those areas. So to give you a bit of an overview so you know how to use it, you'll come up to this entry screen, and the entry screen is a combination of two maps. It's a map from 1873 and 1872, and there's a heap of locations that you can touch. The first location is the Cairns location, which is where the Australian Tropical Herbarium is located. And when you go to touch onto that location, it first comes up with an altitude. So it tells you what altitude that location's at. It gives you a bit of information about the herbarium. It also has 21 press specimen examples of species from the Mountain Flora project. And then we've got 8 of the mountaintops that you can click onto to have a look at some of the views from the mountaintops that these botanists and ecologists are seeing, some images from the field, some species information, and a little bit of QSA, or Queensland State Archives, historical information as well. There's an example of some of the press specimens that you'll see out there, and as you would have seen, the table's really huge, so you get to have some really great views of this, of these things. And the views, amazing views. We've got Professor Crane down here, Stuart Warboys, 2 of the people that I work most closely with in this particular project. Examples of information about the flora, maps that I would have looked at as part of my residency, species detailed information, photographs, great photographs, which are just amazing to look back at some of this history. Just keep in mind this big arrow up here looking at that little round circle of a timber veneer inlay pattern. So how did the Mountain Flora project tie into the Archives Residency? Well, what was my aim? I wanted to use the archives as a mechanism to consider the historical narrative of the mountain flora from an anthropogenic standpoint. I also wanted to explore how other life forms are documented within the human record keeping system and use this information to create new artworks. So I started by doing some tours behind the scenes, and my goodness, like, talk about a visual rich aesthetic for an artist to come into the archives. Alicia took me on my first tour, and I got to see all of this stuff, these really old books. These books are giant. Like when Alicia was showing me these books, like they're massive. And I just picture these people carrying these huge books around. They must have been so heavy and crazy. Then when you open them up, the writing within these books is just so beautiful. There's maps here, you know, and like repositories full of maps. They're rolled, they're flat, they're hung. They're just so much information. There's documents. There's microfilm, there's slides, there's photos, there's video. The content is just, where do I start? Not only that, there's these awesome areas, the girls in the conservation area, and I've actually got a couple of conservation girls here today. I got to go up there, and as an artist, I'm really, really interested in collections and preservation, and how we conserve things. And I could really see that there was some amazing analogies that I could draw as an artist between conservation of human records and conservation of our natural ecology. Plus, they've just got this really cool equipment up there. Look at this stuff. You know, I think I'm just walking up going, what does this one do? What does this one do? And the girls and the team up there were really happy to talk me through it. And also were extremely helpful throughout the project of when I had some ideas. They were very helpful and embracing of these ideas. So I don't even know what this one down here, ultrasonic welder, does, but I just love that it's an ultrasonic welder. So there was just lots of really interesting information, and I found myself, I'd have a day here and I'd find myself driving home going, okay, focus, Donna, what are you doing? Okay, there's so much I could possibly focus on, but just let's get back to what was my core value. I also just want to point out this, which is a Thermo Hydrograph. I'll be talking about that when we get back out into the exhibition as well. So, when I first put in my application to come along here to be creative in residence, I thought, what better place to do my research than look at the High Court case where Queensland took the federal government to court about the listing of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area. What a great place to start. That's going to be awesome. So I came in, had a look at that, was ready to call out the record. It's got a 30-year hold on it. Unfortunately, the release date for it was October 2019, and my residency was from May to September. So I was just outside getting access to those records. That's okay. I had lots of information just in the description of this, this record to start pointing me in a few different directions. So I was back to sitting in the research room, sitting with my, my research screen and start typing in a few more keywords. So I start searching things like wet tropics, northern rainforests, some of the flora species, some of the locations I was looking at. So I started to I was back at square one going, now how do I find out some stories about flora in the Queensland State Archives? And one of the first things that, I seemed to get a lot of hits on was maps. So I started calling out maps. These maps are beautiful. Aesthetically, some of them are huge. Tactile, they're made of linens and wax, and they've got these beautiful handwritten notations on them. So again, very visually rich. I don't know how exactly that's telling the story yet though, you know, I'm just looking, again, getting caught up in this visual aesthetic. So I decided to go back. The discussion about the Wet Tropics World Heritage listing obviously was happening in the political arena. So I thought I'll go and start looking at the cabinet minutes from that time. From 1988 and 1989, the cabinet minutes had been digitised and were available for public access. One of the things I loved about doing some research through the cabinet minutes was I didn't necessarily have to come to the archives to research those cabinet minutes. As you'll see down here, this little PDF sign means that this particular record has been digitised. So I could search this from home and read through the cabinet minutes at home. Looking through the cabinet minutes, of course, then I also came across attachments presented with cabinet minutes. So here we've got a lot of different reports that are being presented to cabinet, and I found a lot of really interesting information in here. So one of the attachments that I brought up just for interest's sake was from the 1980s, and this was really talking about the economical history and the economical background of far north Queensland. So this started to give me an idea of what sort of value was placed on this area that I was researching. And as you can see, we've got mining, we've got timber, we've got agriculture, so bananas, tobacco, beef and dairy were all industries that were happening up in that area. And notice I've said timber. So I'm searching for flora records and I'm finding timber and logging. So I created this artwork. This was one of the first artworks I created. It's called Drawing the Line. And what I was getting a sense of through reading the cabinet minutes and from talking through some people up in the Wet Tropics Management Authority was that there was a lot of toing and froing about the listing of the Wet Tropics area. And as you can already see, there was an economic value up in that area. And like today with mining, there is a lot of people that are tied up and they have their livelihoods tied up in these economic industries. So they were trying to create a boundary line that could keep everyone happy. So here we go, we're going to have a look at this boundary line getting drawn. Again, if we were trying to protect an area, I reckon a square, a circle, even a triangle, maybe I could protect that area. Look at the lines of this boundary. Some of the areas aren't even joined. they're disconnected. So if we're talking about wildlife corridors or protection corridors, it's going to be really hard to protect. You've also got some of the backing, or the stakeholders that might back onto these areas might allow weed infestation, pest infestation. Cattle might get, into that area. So that was really the first artwork that I created, called Drawing the Line, which is really talking about this really complex boundary line for the wet tropics area. And I'll talk a bit more about the actual artwork when we get out there as well. So I also found some other interesting documents. This one's from the Bureau of Investigation back in the 1950s. This quote that I found in one of the reports: "This land, regarded as the most fertile in Australia, is gradually being converted into a desert. And if the position is to be retrieved, reforestation will have to be part of the process. Remember the Eastern proverb, forest precedes man, deserts follow him. Again, a tree is not just an inanimate mass of wood, it's a living entity, and it has been called into cooperation with man for the purpose of perfecting creation's plan." And if we just have a look at who wrote that, Secretary of the North Queensland Sawmillers Association. There was a lot of knowledge in the forestry department. I'm not sure, how many other people are actually aware that a lot of our botanists and ecologists, before we had herbariums, were working for the forestry department and capturing a lot of information. In fact, the Australian Tropical Herbarium has got records from the Atherton Forestry Department. Another document. So I really started to look at the forestry department now. And here's a report done in 1931. This was when I first started to see some names of my species actually listed. So here we've got a listing. It is listed as commercial timbers, but timber and its qualities. So here I've just got the inset talking about the Queensland kauri. So the Queensland kauri is from the genus Agathis genus, and one of the plants in the Tropical Mountain Flora project is also from the Agathis genus. Different species, but from the same family. So here we can see Queensland kauri is listed. It's well thought of for cabinet work, joinery, panelling, framing, shelving, and internal sheeting and flooring of houses and railway carriages. From that document, I was able to then start cross-checking my mountain flora species with some of the actual documents listed in the Queensland State Archives records. So one of the issues that I was having is that a lot of the records that I was finding here were actually listing common names, not species names. And any botanist or ecologist would know that sometimes a common name can be used to describe a number of species. And so here we've got the listing of the common name over here, and then some of the species in the tropical mountain flora. Right up the top, the little fella I've been talking about all along, the Litzia granitica. His common name is Bollywood, and Bollywood I was finding in some of these maps and some of these listings. Pretty cool name too. You'll notice anything there with a little asterisk next to it means that it does produce millable logs. Now that term is used when I'm looking up for species information. I've been using, along with my resources up in the Australian Tropical Herbarium, this, which is the Australian Tropical Rainforest Plants edition number 7, and that gives a lot of really detailed species information. And one of the bits of information it does say is whether it produces millable logs. We've also got the quandong, which was another name that I found quite often in maps and documents, and that's the Iliocarpus genus. And we've got here a couple of Iliocarpus in the tropical mountain flora, and also the Queensland kauri. Now I was talking about the genus Agathis, which is a kauri, but the one that we see and the one that we think of with the kauri of being those massive big trees and those great big slices of timber are actually Agathis palmerstoni. So they're a different species to the species that we were looking at. But when I went to look, the common name is still called the Queensland kauri. So you can see that there's a relationship there. So once I started to confirm that some of my species had relations in the archives, I started bringing out some of those maps again. And some of those maps which you can't quite see here, but you can when you look at the big interactive table. There's all species names, common names listed on these maps. So again, I started to get a sense of presence of these species within the archives. I also then started to go, okay, so I found their name, wonder if I can find some photos of them. So I was able to call out some forestry department photos. Most of these photos that I found were from 1935 to 1975. Beautiful, beautiful photos, but not all of them have been digitised, and not all of them have got the photos and their description located together. So I was calling out photo albums that might have had 50 to 100 photos in them. And then I was calling out a box of index cards, and I would have to go through the photos and look for something that looked like it probably could be tropical related, find out the little number it had on it, and then find the index card to see if it A, was from North Queensland, B, may have had an image of one of the species that I was looking at for the Mountain Flora project. So again, it was a little bit of a rabbit hole. The photos were so beautiful that I had to keep refocusing. But I found some beautiful photos. And I did find photos from North Queensland, and I did find photos of relations to the mountain flora species. So over here, you'll see this species here is a Flinders braleyana, and one of the foresters standing next to this species here. Flinders braleyana does have a relative in the project, the Flinders opicifolia. So I sort of felt like I was finding a cousin or an auntie or an uncle. Here we go, we've got another one over here, Flinders braleyana. Just the majesty of this photo, these are people down here. Yeah, so just to give you an idea of scale. So I suppose, looking at those photos, I found their names, I found them written, now I've found photos. I'm really doing genealogical research, aren't I? And it's really interesting because when I was doing all my research in the research room, most of the people here are doing genealogical research, and they're getting excited when they find their auntie's name or a relation's name written down. And I was getting the same excitement every time I found one of these species written down. I was even more excited when I started to see photos. So that really inspired me to create this work, which is the Litsea granitica, who's been a little feature right through this whole talk. I thought the project itself is all about species getting displaced. They're losing their habitat. Where do they go? Well, then I, as an artist, start thinking, yeah, where would they go? What's an imagined future? What would happen if they could uproot and walk around? Where would they go? Well, maybe they might come to the archives and they might search for their family. So here we go, we've got this little guy, and you may have seen as you come through, this is actually an animation, and he's running through the archives looking for kin, searching for family, and I feel like that's what I've been doing during this project. So given that he's having a bit of a walk through the archives, I feel like we should now go out and I'll give you a bit of a talk through some of the artworks themselves, if everyone's up for it. So I thought I would start. Remember I said I wanted to look at the High Court case, and I couldn't get access to it. This is my artwork that I created. This is called Rainforest Case. So I couldn't actually look at the documents, but I knew that there was a case, so I've created this Rainforest Case. And we've got one of the species in here, the Flindersia opicifolia, I'm probably not saying it correctly, opicifolia, and it's got a background of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area boundary over the top of it there. So the species that's in here is taken from the Australian National Botanic Gardens when I was looking at their propagation species growing down there. So it's an image I've taken there, and then I've digitally collaged it into that image. And talking about the different propagation specimens, if we then look at these works over here, so these works on the wall here are all made up of images taken down at the Australian National Botanic Gardens. So they're all macro images that I took of the species, and then they've been laid up to create these. They could be considered wreaths, or they could be considered just beautiful objects. I decided to call this series the Legacy Series. And it's sort of in a way to sort of talk about these plants as being threatened, but also to talk about these plants as being really beautiful. They're really beautiful objects, and some of these plants are so tiny. This little one here is like the flower. It's just so tiny. The whole plant is just so little. And, you know, do people even know? You know, would they walk past it, or would they stop and look at it? And do you even know its story, that it is, you know, currently under threat? It's endemic. It grows in the cloud rainforest. It doesn't grow anywhere else. So if it loses its habitat, it's lost its home. And I suppose that's what all of these stories are really trying to speak about, is to talk about the importance of species, not only the importance of species as individual species, but the importance of their ecological community. So what other relationships do these plants have, and what other life is it supporting? And the reality is that we don't even know a lot of the species that this life is supporting. There's a lot of research that still hasn't been done in our soils, and looking at all the relationships that are happening down there, and all the microbiota and microorganisms that are happening down there. So it's just, I suppose, trying to draw attention and highlight, and just draw some attention to these beautiful plants. Over here we'll see the drawing the line work. So as you can see, it's a sculptural work. You can see that the projection is falling over the top of this, with the boundary lines getting drawn, repeatedly drawn and undrawn over the top of it. All of the little sculptural works are created out of gold velvet to really talk about values. And a lot of the documents I was finding was really talking about the economic value of plants as timber. So I started to think, well, you know what? They have a value just in their own right, and they are very precious, and our flora is very precious. It's taped up, bound in red tape. So anybody, would probably draw those analogies to perhaps bureaucracy and red tape. And red tape is there to not only discourage some things or hold some things up, but it's also there to be helpful. So it's also there to protect. So it's protecting and conserving in its own way. I also love it because every time I called out documents here in the archives, they were quite often bound in red tape. It was really interesting to find out that they don't use red tape in the archive anymore because it actually stains the document. So they were throwing out the red tape. So any documents that are called out, they were taking the red tape off and throwing it. And I went, I'll have the red tape. I think I can use it in artwork. And also the girls from the conservation lab actually gave me some red tape to take home and use as well for this process. They also taught me the knot. There's a special knot that the archivists use to tie it, and I did try and actually use the knot, but some of my species were too tiny. I just couldn't quite get it to work. But I did practice it, and I could do it, Christy. By the end, I got it really well done. Their knot is so great because you just pull it and it all just unravels. It's very, very cool. So we've got the red tape over here sort of talking about the pros and cons. You'll also notice that they're all on different mounts. The mounts that are in the sort of darker timber and turned timber is talking about some of the species that would have had an association with the timber industry or the logging industry. And then some of the species that you've got down here in the little glass vials are little orchids. Any of the little ones on a cardboard plinth, either herbs or vines. If it's mounted on the front of the plinth, it means it's a vine because it's crawling up. All the rest are mounted on top. And then we've got an example of one of the little species that was only found last year, presumed extinct, and they found it. It's a tiny little filmy fern. So that was really exciting to find, that found it. And you'll see also on the labels, you'll see little dots. If it's got a red dot on it, means it's endangered, and if it's got a blue dot, it's vulnerable, and if it's got a yellow dot, it's near threatened. So it also gives you a bit of a history, and it does tell you the species name on the little tags, and also when it was first discovered. So over here, we have our little fella exploring the archives. And he's looking everywhere. He's going into the research room, he's going into the repository, he's also going up to the conservation lab because, like me, he loved being up there. So he's looking to try and find family and to find a sense of place. I called this one Transplant Searching for Kin because he is searching for family. And then I've got this work right next to it because this work is really about becoming kin. So this work here, aesthetically, after talking to the girls in the Preservation and Conservation Lab, one of the really interesting things that they told me was about the diversity of records that they get here through the archives, and that they're constantly having to learn new techniques and use different techniques to conserve the variety of material that they get through. We were having a bit of a chat about you know, things like VHS and film and how some of the records are really hard to conserve, and how do you know what to conserve? Where's the priority? And some of the stuff that is using machinery, some of the machinery is now obsolete. So how do you even read that record anymore if the machinery isn't there? Who remembers the floppy disks? Like, that old technology. And that's what these guys are coping with. They've got technology from, you know, really early records and film right up until what we've got today in this digital world that we have. And it was really interesting for them to sort of say, well, you know what, the best record really is something like microfilm, where all you need is a light and a magnifying glass and you can read the record. And it was through that made me create this work. All you need is a light and a magnifying glass and you can read the record. So I'm thinking, what would our future records look like? I wonder if our future records might contain something that was, rather than being more anthropogenic, maybe it was coming from more of a multi-species perspective. What happens if all species, including plants, were given equal rights to what we have? Well, maybe they'd have to apply for citizenship. So here, they've got these little multi-species applications for citizenship here. They're put on an anthropogenic form. So they're asking things like, who is your next of kin? What's your living conditions? What's your preferred living conditions? Are you male, female, or both? All of these things can be answered. So they all have correct species information. Once I'd created these little documents, they were sent up to the Australian Tropical Herbarium, who fact-checked it all to make sure I had all my details correct. So you actually find a lot about the plant species on there, but it's just a way to sort of just have a think about the way we view all species, and is there a hierarchy that we have, you know, when we're thinking about species. So by using the magnifying glass, you can have a read of that, and I do welcome you to do that. It can just be gently turned around to have a look at each of those documents, and all of those documents are talking about one of the species in the Mountain Flora project. So here, when we started talking about how excited I was that he's found some family, we've actually got now the Flinders braleyana, and we've got one of the foresters now holding one of the propagated specimens of the Flindersia opicifolia. So again, he's standing there with his family. So this was Untitled sort of by the time I created this, but probably a better title for this is Family Portrait. Here we've got an image with that I've merged a couple of images together. One of the beautiful forestry signs from the George Street Forestry building back in the 1950s 's onto one of these, you know, beautiful rainforest plants, again the Flindersia. Here we're talking about the cowrie, so the Agathis palmerstoni here, and he's holding the Agathis atripura here. So, and you can see, again, get the scale of the size of these cowrie trees. And this one here, the forestry department in the 50s did these amazing displays at the RNA show, and they would take up whole rooms of these elaborate displays. And looking at those photos were just amazing. This particular year, their theme was Save the Tree. So I just thought that was a great sign to put on that particular tree. Because the project itself was really all about climate and climate control and abilities to you know, to try and maintain a certain microclimate, when I was up in the preservation lab, I saw the Thermo Hydrograph here. So on the top line, it actually captures the temperature. On the bottom line, it captures the relative humidity. So I thought, what a great way to incorporate an artwork into this. The girls in the lab, this is from the Queensland State Archives. This is one of theirs. They also allowed me to take one home that's been running in my studio at home as well. So I've been capturing the temperature and humidity at home. The artwork itself inside is made up of an image here, which is taken from one of the mountaintops up in Mount Lewis, taken by one of the botanists from down at the Australian National Botanic Gardens who had allowed me to use her image in this artwork. And then it's along the top has a little poem along the top talking about just my reflections on this particular process and loss of species and what we're doing to conserve it. So I've been running these machines in my studio and here to just have a look over the exhibition. So you can see the top line is from my studio, so we can see a lot of variation. We can see here a temperature controlled line here, as it should be. The archive should be kept at a certain condition to protect all of their documents. So it's just a conversation, I suppose, about conservation of anthropogenic records and conservation of our natural environments and what we're doing.